Thank you all for joining us. It's the second session of our 2024 Range and Pasture webinar training series. Um, so if you joined us for our first session, you're going to see a lot of the same material, but it's another chance to win a cooler. So stay here, stay in tune, and we'll hopefully get another crack at it. But if it's your first time, we welcome you, and I'm going to do some quick introductions. So we're light one Corteva representative today, Tanner Smith, Eastern South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. He had an emergency pop up today, so wasn't able to make it. But I'll turn over to Abe to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Abe Smith. I'm the territory manager for Iowa, as well as what we refer to as Eastern Nebraska, which basically is from North Platte going east. And it's a pleasure to be with you guys today. I've been with Corteva or Dow now for the last 27 seasons. And so it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, with the lion's share of those years being involved in the ranch and pasture business.
Here, and I'm Spian Oliver. I'm the Associate Territory Manager working under Tanner Smith. I'm based in southern Minnesota, primarily working in Minnesota and Wisconsin, range and pasture department. So just graduated from the University of Georgia, and they pulled the fellow from Georgia up to southern Minnesota to see what a winter is. But we're gonna go ahead and get started. I wanted to first kind of touch up on if we have questions throughout the webinar. There's a Q&A icon at the top of the screen that you can use. If you have a question in the moment, go ahead and type your question in, and we'll make sure we address it either at a break or at the end of the webinar when it comes time for that. So brief run through of our agenda for the next 30-45 minutes. We're going to go through new developments from Corteva, some timing and products for local weeds, especially that spurge and thistle that we're always after, grazing, haying, and manure restrictions, brush control, and finally how we can grow the business and address any of those questions that we may have throughout the series. So to start it out, I wanted to kind of start with what's new from Corteva. And kind of how we're going to frame this conversation is around four key aspects. So we have DuraCore, which you may be familiar with, and some other products that you might not be as familiar with, such as Ultigraze or Proclova. So we're going to dive into those and get going with that conversation. So DuraCore is its fourth season in the industry, so you may be familiar with it, and some folks may not be. But what it really brings to the table is a new active ingredient called Rinskor Active. It's the latest AI to come into the pasture market in 15 years. And what Rinskor is going to do is it's going to modernize your pasture spray program. You're going to have 140 species of broadleaves controlled, which is 40 more than Grazon Next, which is traditionally what's covered this pasture acre. And like I said, modernizing the formulation. Rinskor has lower volatility risk, low odor, and low application rate. And what that's going to do is it's going to improve handling and increase your confidence when it comes to pasture applications. It mixes very well with other pasture herbicides to be an integral piece of the puzzle when it comes to creating special recommendations for your pastures. And it's also weed and feed ready, which we'll talk about here in a second, but it mixes very well on impregnated fertilizer as well with UAN. So this is going to tie into our first poll question. So it is, does your location sell pasture fertility and or custom apply pasture fertilizer? So we can get that whole question up here in a second. It should be multiple choice. You can punch in your answer there.
I don't think it's popped up yet. There we are.
Are y'all seeing a variable rate seeding poll question?
Yeah, yeah.
Great insight, but
Yeah, I don't think this poll question is going to generate the information we were looking for, Stan.
no, it doesn't look like it. Good to know though.
Yeah.
Let's see, we may not be able to get that our pasture poll question up there, which isn't the end of the world if we don't have it, but
Well, we can still share it with them. You click share results. Unfortunately, the wrong question popped up here, and I'm not sure where variable rate seating came from, but about 80% of you only have 0-1 customers doing variable rate seating. Our question really had the nature of it, how many of you are actually doing custom, pasture fertility or custom pasture fertilizer applications? And I would say there, in my region in general, a lot of folks are selling pasture fertility, whether they're doing it with big rigs or spinner rigs. More than 50% of the locations have some sort of pasture fertility involvement.
sure. Well, going into this, so what DuraCore is going to provide, when we talk about its reduced use rate and its flexibility when it comes to being applied with fertilizer, is a program called UltiGraze. So UltiGraze is a service you would provide as a certified UltiGraze retailer with dry fertilizer impregnated with DuraCore. And what that's going to do is provide one pass better grass, convenience and efficiency for the grower. And obviously, one of the first thoughts in our heads, and I know it's in the first thought in yours, is we don't want any issues of cross contamination or any accidental exposure to vulnerable crops. So we do require designated equipment when it comes to UltiGraze. And we've worked with some growers and some producers to develop some innovative ways to reduce that risk. And one example is modifying a tender truck to be used as a blending system. You can see an auxiliary tank on the side for herbicide, and you will inject the herbicide into the auger and blend that way, just to keep your herbicide contact localized in that auger, and be able to be more efficient that way and not having to clean out blenders and anything like that.
And we do have people using more traditional systems as well. So if you do have the ability to dedicate a big blender, that is completely possible as well.
For sure. And as part of that idea of wanting to ensure safety across all facets of your operation, we do require that material is dyed just to ensure that folks on your crew are going to know that the blue fertilizer goes out on pasture because it will have treated herbicide on it. So just another example of how we can make this work with your operation and be flexible with it to provide a higher level of service for your customers and convenience and efficiency for them and market expansion and hopefully sell more fertilizer for y'all is what we want. So let's see. And the next product is pending EPA registration, but it hopefully answers the question. It will answer the question if we are able to get registration of how can I control broadleaf weeds if I want to maintain a white clover or annual Lespedeza pasture grazing forage. So this is a non-residual herbicide that contains Rinskor active that we discussed in DuraCore, and a low rate of 2,4-D that's going to preserve white clover in your pastures. So it's also safe on other beneficials, as I mentioned, the annual Lespedeza. and it's a great fit for wildlife food plots. If some of your customers are looking to maintain long-term food plots, Proclova is going to protect those beneficial forbs and remove uh, weed pressure there. And it carries the same broad spectrum as Rinskor does in Duracore. So you're going to have that increased spectrum of control as well as the increased confidence in applications with Proclova. But we're pending EPA registration, anticipating this year. So I'm gonna turn it over to Abe to
Hey,
dive.
Sven, let's go back to your Ultra slide real quick. Someone in the Q&A did comment that, you know, on your blue fertilizer, the way we recommend dyeing it, that yeah, Agritane, there are other products out there that do color products, color fertilizer as well. So in this context, the dye is not really critical. We actually have customers using their own, you know, if red is a feature of their marketing, they're dyeing it red. The color is not necessarily innately critical, so it doesn't have to be blue or green or even red. We can utilize that for your organization. But yeah, there are other products that are out there that dye the fertilizer. In the context of this, with a dedicated blender, I don't think there would be concern about maybe some confusion there. Hopefully in the context where it's coming out of a dedicated blending type unit, there would be knowledge of that. And the other thing we do recommend with all of anyone who's using Ultigraze or treated fertilizer products is we're going to have labels on any of the spinner rigs that are out there. So we can placard or sticker anything that is dedicated toward pasture equipment. Our desire is to not see this end up in a crop situation, because that could be bad news for everyone involved. The dye, though, is to at least make people pause and recognize that this fertilizer is different. Let's ask why it is and why it might be in a rig that is labeled for pasture use only. So we continue to work on cleanup procedures or getting printed materials towards that to explain the cleanup procedure. But we've had good success with people power washing any of the fertilizer rigs and being able to go back to rotate that. Once they clean them, you pull the stickers off and you can go back into a crop situation with no hassles.
For sure.
Okay.
Thank you for your
All right,
clarifying
let's
question.
roll on. All right, so we are introducing Grazon PD3 this year, and Grazon PD3 is what you would probably know as, well, you'd be most familiar with Grazon P plus D, which is picloram or Tordon with 2,4-D, with the exception that this is our 2,4-D choline that we utilize in our Enlist platform. It does not have all the Enlist technologies built into that, but definitely the choline with the low volatility, low odor, and because of the choline formulation, we can actually concentrate this much lower, much more than what you could with a Grazon P plus D. So we have customers choosing this to replace their Grazon P plus D, especially in situations where volatility or drift has been an issue for them. There's, you know, the 2,4-Ds are very similar. One in the P plus D would be the amine formulation or the triisopropyl amine formulation. And over the years, that has had a notoriety for having sprayability issues, things that may be more driftable depending on how you're spraying it. We don't get similar comments out of the choline formulation. Now, with all that said, anytime you're spraying a picloram-based product, you would want to choose nozzles and tips that are at least coarse, if not extra coarse. There's some ways that you can, you know, improve the situation around potential drift issues by choosing the right equipment. But again, I think having the lower odor, though, and I get a lot of positive comments about using something like a Grazon PD3 because of the lower odor compared to your typical amine odor, especially for those of you that are familiar with Grazon P plus D. Now, for many people, they're still going to stick with a Duracore or a Grazon Next because those two are non-restricted products. Grazon PD3 is still a restricted use product, and for many customers, it's not a desirable use pattern. They don't want to do the paperwork. But if you have certain species of weeds, like spurge, milkweed, it may be something to really consider. And this was previously labeled as grass fennel. We've kind of remarketed, taken a different approach to the market with PD3. And I think for some of those toughest weed problems, or especially those with intermixed brush, it may be a solution that could be worth looking at. Go ahead. Let's talk about timings, products, best practices for these local weeds that you have. And if you do have some specific weeds you want us to address, throw them up in the questions, the question and answer portion. We're happy to give you some specific recommendations here on the fly. Okay. So when you're asked for the best time to spray pastures, what are we most likely to recommend? And so the question goes to you, as you're the folks most in touch with the producers that come in. When do you like to recommend? And some of those, I can anticipate some of the answers, but some of those are spring, because that's when people are coming in through the door. Some of them are driven by CRP in your local area and the restrictions around CRP. So go ahead and throw up that question. Let them answer this. Some of them just based around the practices of the area historically, when people are able to spray. So let's see if this question shows up right this round. Still waiting for it to pop up there. There we go.
Yeah.
So spring, fall, or spray it whenever. One of the other things I'll point out here as we throw up the answers here shortly is that sometimes your species of weeds matters. So pay attention to some of the things I have about when we would time certain things for spring versus fall. And sometimes the just spray it answer ends up being the right one. I think we're close enough there. I think we can close that poll. And go ahead and throw those up there. So we're actually a pretty even distribution there. About 45% of people just say spring. 48% or nearly half would say fall. And 3 of you give the answer that I commonly give anymore, which is just to spray it. So about 10% of you say just spray it. And this really comes down oftentimes to what time fits best for the producer. I've found that oftentimes we try and put things into a box, and a producer has the rationale that they want to try and spray it. Now, there's the best time to spray it by the book and by the label, but oftentimes if guys can't get it sprayed in the time frame that might be best, the next best time frame is when they can get it sprayed, because otherwise it's going to go untreated oftentimes. So we do have to work around some of the producer's needs there. But if they're going to be picky, or they're trying to look for the best timing, we can sure help them with that. So let's pull that down and we can go on from there. So there are some differences between spring treatments and fall treatments here. I'm going to close that window on mine. So for spring application, usually we're trying to time these things through May and June. Some of our residual applicators for Grazon Next or Duracor, they're going to be maybe going in April, especially with aerial, before a lot of crop work gets done, where we're more concerned about potentially having off-target issues with soybeans in the area. But generally speaking, May and June are probably the most common times I see for spring application. And we want to spray when those weeds are 8 to 12 inches tall. We want to spray when they're smaller and not when they're bigger, because bigger weeds equals more rates. It equals tank mix partners, and it equals more complexity and probably not as much success overall trying to spray bigger weeds. But what we're targeting in the spring is going to be summer annuals. So you get your weeds like henbit, your cockleburs, maybe things like kochia, snow on the mountain marijuana you see listed there. But we're also going to treat biennials. We're going to treat your musk thistle, bull thistle, kind of your whole thistle complex there. As well as things like curly cup gumweed, goldenrod, sweet clover, and carrot species. And then you get into your perennials, things like ironweed and Canada thistle. So oftentimes these things are well treated once they're up and once they're exposed. But when they emerge, and so we have territory here today represented from Superior, Nebraska, all the way up to Bemidji, Minnesota, and further north. Okay. So that timing may not be the 1st of May. As you get into northern Minnesota, that might be more like the 10th of June overall. So there's things that we have to consider, and you locally make the best recommendations for your producers by helping scout those weeds or notice what's going on around them. So commonly, what we're recommending nowadays is going to be 16 to 20 ounces of Duracor in that spring range with a non-ionic surfactant. You don't have to be exotic with it, but usually an NIS, especially on early season weeds, is very effective to helping get good coverage and making sure that herbicide distributes over the leaves of those plants. Or Grazon Next HL 28 ounces to 34 ounces. Many folks kind of default to a quart being the standard rate there, which is just shy of the maximum. If you're dealing with Canada thistle, you may want to consider those 2 extra ounces of Grazon Next, because that gives you almost about 1/3 of an ounce of milestone, which actually is pretty meaningful there. And again, use a non-ionic surfactant in that mix, does a very nice job. Okay. And let's go back to spring. Go back to spring. We do have a comment here in Q&A. When's the best time to spray multiflora rose? I would say the best time to spray multiflora rose is actually once you see the leaves are fully out on it. We don't want to spray it too early. So this is not a plant you want to spray at May 1st. You probably are going to be spraying this probably June 10th. And we'll talk about brush applications specifically, but later in the summer, July is kind of the peak time frame to be spraying brush, which doesn't always work for people. But if you ask me the best date to spray brush like multiflora rose and others, I would say July, and then working outwards from that, next best timings is going to be June and August, and then beyond that, September would be kind of the lowest preferred time frame for that. For field bindweed, when would we prefer to spray field bindweed? Best product to use? I would say that things like field bindweed, depending on the circumstance or situation that you're in, a product like a Grazon PD3 might be a really good choice to consider for that. If you're in a situation where you can use a restricted use product, you're not down in a riparian area near water. But I would probably look at a Grazon PD3, check that label out, and it's probably going to be something that commonly, depending on, again, the situation, circumstance, this is something that can be sprayed spring or fall. We'll talk about fall application here shortly, but bindweed could be sprayed either time frame. Generally speaking, the results that I've seen on many university trials would suggest that fall treatments are marginally better, about 5% by many assessments that I've seen, 5 to 10% better than what a spring application would be. To me, that's not enough to say I would only do it during fall. Okay. This again kind of goes back to the local practices and when your producer has time to do it. If your producer has time to do it in the spring, but not in the fall, 10% difference is not going to be that critical to make it a different choice there. Have him spray it when he has time to. Okay. Let's look at the fall applications there. Fall application window is going to be early fall before the first ground freeze. And generally speaking, for the territory that's represented here today, that's going to be mid-September to mid-November. For many of my customers here in central Nebraska where I live, my date that I usually consider is like October 15. That's usually when we get at least one good hard frost, but the ground isn't frozen yet. And so if the weeds that are driving your choices there are oriented around summer annuals, marijuana, sunflowers, henbit, things like that, we're not going to recommend a fall treatment for that. Fall treatments usually are best pointed towards when we have biennials as well as perennials. So we're going to think about things like thistles, common mullein, wormwood, the carrot species, wild carrot, maybe wild parsnip could be on that list. Even things like snow on the mountain, or you get into your perennial list, you get into Canada thistle specifically through most of the geography represented here today. Canada thistle as well as leafy spurge are something that we can really consider doing fall applications and going after the rosette stage of biennials or perennials. There's a lot of folks in Iowa that I've run across here over the last 3 seasons that really think spurge spraying or thistle spraying needs to be done in September. And again, the data would back us up to say that we at least want one hard frost before we do that spraying for the best option. But sometimes, again, those come down to local practices or when producers have a window to do it. Harvest interferes with spraying after October 15th for many producers across Iowa, but it would be a better time frame to do it. So you can spray from October 1st all the way until the ground is frozen hard, and we're going to see better results in those things. In the fall, generally, we're going to see rates go up. So Duracore 18 to 20 ounces, again, with an NIS out there, we're going to really crank those rates up a little bit higher. We're going to take the low end off those rates. The Graze on Next rates, 28 to 34, very similar. I would probably move that from 28 to 30 to 34, ultimately, for many producers. And again, for the folks that have been using 32 ounces of Graze on Next, if you're going after a Canada thistle, using that 34-ounce use rate might be a nice benefit to consider to get a little bit more thistle activity out of that sort of treatment. Okay. I'm going to turn it back over to Sven here. Well, let's go through this last slide here. So for thistle or leafy spurge or wild parsnip, for thistle, again, spring or fall, Duracore has been a really good solution, been performing very well. Use it with an NIS. For leafy spurge, Graze on PD3 at the higher end of the rate range. The Graze on PD3 you can use as low as 20 ounces an acre, but for spurge, you're going to see commonly 40 ounces an acre all the way up to 80 ounces an acre. So we are going to lean on those rates quite a bit and use those at the high end of the rate range. And then for parsnip, if you're not familiar with wild parsnip, especially in Minnesota and Iowa and eastern Nebraska, you are going to want to get familiar with Duracore. Duracore is a great solution for wild parsnip. Wild parsnip is a weed that has come on the radar very quickly here in the last 5 years, causes skin irritations, causes injuries to animals, basically skin lesions that really swell up and blister up and impacts humans as well. So if you have a producer that's dealing with wild parsnip, the solution has been very, very simple for us. There's been a couple other products over the years that have worked all right on it. They haven't been our products, but Duracore has been like a laser on those things and performed excessively well.
For sure. So kind of some common questions that we generally get asked, coming after these recommendations and kind of details and product use. One of the first is, can I spray Duracore Tordon around trees? You've got pasture edges, whether it's shelter belts or fence lines, you're trying to maybe maintain a certain desired tree species. And we say, you want to be very careful around your tree species, especially when it comes to direct herbicide contact, but even when it comes to the drip line of the tree's limbs. That's generally a rule of thumb as to where the root impact would be. So if you stay out of the tree's drip line with Duracore or Tordon products, that's generally a rule of thumb to use in those situations. And I just put a link in the chat, so y'all feel free to go to that. It's a showpad link with resources, and you can find a sheet there that says it's called Around Woody Plants with Graze on Next. It kind of outlines some of our recommendations there to ensure we're safely using those.
I would also add to that, Sven, that if you have customers that are concerned with tree activity or minimizing tree damage, Duracore or Graze on Next would be the first choice on that. Tordon, even Tordon RTU around trees, we see a little bit more movement, potential for movement. And generally speaking, Milestone, the aminopyrrolid component of both Graze on Next and Duracore, are going to be safer around most trees. It's not a universal statement. Things like red buds show injury with aminopyrrolid. Locust trees, if you have locust trees you want to keep for some reason, you don't want to use much around them, because both Tordon and Graze on Next, Duracore, the aminopyrrolide complex of product can be very hard on those. So if you have questions about a specific situation, please reach out to us directly. That's why we're here. We're happy to help you.
Conditions, those circumstances are going to be slightly mitigated when it comes to using an adjuvant. So it's going to improve effectiveness there. So our general recommendation is a 0.25% NIS, so a quart per 100 gallons of spray solution, or a 1% MSO works very well. However, you might lead to some grass damage, which comes to gauging expectations with your customers. You know, if they're dead set on getting rid of weeds, and willing to tolerate some grass damage, that's a conversation you can have. But as a basic recommendation, we say 0.25% NIS.
Yeah, the grass damage you're going to see there is just the burn of the oil on the grass, which is very transient, but does cause producers to usually give you a phone call that you can avoid by giving them heads up on the front end.
Sure. So now we're going to dive into a little bit of some of the grazing, haying, and manure restrictions that come with our products. And it's one of the advantage of Corteva's line of products is that it's the strongest line of defense against weeds, and it provides long-term control. But with that strength, we've got to have these conversations about certain expectations we need to set for our customers. So first off, defining a grazing restriction is any special instruction on the label that pertains to applying herbicide in an area that's currently holding livestock. So it's not, you know, similar to a reentry interval or things like that. It's applying herbicide with livestock in the pasture. And if you can see from our table here on the right side, there is an important distinguishing characteristic made in livestock, in that it pertains primarily to lactating dairy animals. That means dairy animals that are being milked for human consumption or for sale, as opposed to a beef animal that is milking or nursing a calf. So that is an important distinguishing trait there that pertains to our grazing restrictions. So our four products on the left side of the table there that carry no restriction are Duracore, Grazon Next, Remedy Ultra, and Proclova is anticipated to not have a grazing restriction. So that means these products can be applied with livestock in the pasture. So your producers don't have any concerns with those. And on the right side, you can see the products that do have a grazing restriction. So Grazon PD3, Remedy Crossbow, which is a brush herbicide, Tordon 22K, as well as Grazon Pete Plus D, will all have grazing restrictions with different time periods from application that would restrict grazing there. But they all apply to lactating dairy.
Yeah, and I would just distinguish, I get this question a lot. This is not necessarily for cow-calf pairs, okay? This is for dairy classification of livestock. This is for livestock that is being actively used in dairy production. And so if you're not milking those cows and putting that into the food supply, the concern goes away. So if this is cow-calf operation, mama cows and baby cows, the issue is not there. This is specifically to dairy.
For sure. So moving on into haying and manure restrictions, similar to grazing restrictions, it's any instruction around the harvesting, movement, or use of herbicide treated hay or manure. And we like to think of our products in two families or two groups. The first being aminopyrrolide that we've talked about, or milestone. These are going to be Duracore, Grazon Next, Chaparral, those products. And then there's picloram or tordon, which is Grazon PD3, Grazon P plus D, and tordon 22K. And these will all have haying and manure restrictions when it comes to how you can use hay, move hay, as well as use the manure from treated grazing. So on the right, you'll see a little pictogram that's on all the labels that kind of simplify the restrictions and how we're able to use hay from treated sites. And we'll run through kind of some important figures to make sure we look at. But the biggest number we can point out here is 18 months. So 18 months is the time frame or the period that the residual in this active ingredient breaks down. So if you look at that first bullet, it says, do not use grasses treated with Duracor in the preceding 18 months for hay intended for export outside of the United States. So essentially what that is saying is 18 months post-application, that hay field is considered to still have residual active ingredient in that product. So if you feed it to cattle on stubble, you're going to see the impact of that residual for 18 months post-application. And what that means is hay that's harvested 18 months, it can't be sold off farm. So if you have a hay producer who's treating his hay fields, he's able to use it on his own operation, but it's not able to be transported off the farm for sale. Hay from treated areas treated with this product in preceding 18 months cannot be used for silage, haylage, baleage, or green chop unless allowed by supplemental labeling. So this follows along with the movement of hay, similar, just carrying through with the silage and haylage accent area. And the same follows with the 18-month period. Either allow the residual to break down before using it over the 18-month period, or don't sell it off the farm for that 18 months. And then it's the second from the last there at the bottom. It says, do not use hay from areas treated with Duracor herbicide within the preceding 18 months, or manure from animals who are feeding on hay treated with Duracor. So if you have a circumstance where cattle are grazing a Duracor treated pasture, and after harvest, you pull the fence up and you let them graze on stubble, you're going to see the impact of that residual herbicide the following season when it comes time to plant. So in being able to mitigate this barrier or concern, you can allow those cattle or that livestock to graze untreated feed for a period of 3 days. And what this 3 days is going to do is it's going to allow these livestock to clear the rumen, make sure all the treated feed is no longer in their system, and they're able to graze on potentially vulnerable areas. Same applies to manure. So if they're grazing treated pasture, you want to pull them off for 3 days, and then you'll be able to collect that manure without having to worry of having that residual active ingredient. So, and last bullet there, do not use grasses treated with Duracor for seed production, just following along with that. And this specific instance applies to Duracor, but it's the same for Grazon Next and Chaparral as well. And getting into the supplemental labeling, we did mention there for a little bit. So there are revisions that allow for hay movement off the farm or ranch, as well as grass harvested for silage, baleage, or green chop. North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska are the only states in this area for the supplemental movement of hay. But that supplemental label is there if that applies to you in this geography. And there are additional revisions for the use on rights of way and utility lines that cross or transect grazed areas. And you'll be able to do that in North and South Dakota. So you have that supplemental ability there. Are there any questions in the chat when it comes to residual activity or
Does not look like there's any pending questions there. Well, you know, I just would add that folks from Nebraska don't have the restrictions. There's something miraculous that happens at the Missouri River where Iowa has the restrictions and Nebraska doesn't. But it is a good common practice just to be aware whether if you have the supplemental labels or not. I hope the previous slide is a couple slides are not that intimidating. We've used these products for years, whether it's picorium based products or aminopyrrolide based products. They can be used to have very low impact on crop ground. You just have to be smart in terms of how you're utilizing them and how you might, if you have cattle on treated pastures, to have a place to paddock them for a couple days or put them into a feedlot for a couple days in that transition, or at least have the producers understand that there's potential that they could see some of those impacts. And even 3 days is a long time for many people. 24 hours makes a big difference. 48 hours is a really helpful thing. 72 hours gets you really where we don't see any results. So even if they're limited in terms of time, they can put them in a feedlot or some sort of transition area. Every hour helps to that end.
Sure.
All right, it's 9:40. We're going to turn our eyes towards brush control here, which is a smaller portion of our portfolio, but usually one that is still you get a lot of questions on. And this is a very prescriptive sort of segment of the marketplace, but we do have some general things we can cover. And so we wish we had a silver bullet for all the brush species out there, but it is, again, prescriptive, it's species specific, and it's usually based on timing. Two big points we're going to make is we're going to cover the method of application, foliar versus basal versus cut stump, and we're going to point you towards some of the tools that we have out there. And the number one tool that you have out there would be Spen, myself, and Tanner to make those recommendations to you. And we're happy to do that. And we have a variety of resources. Some of them are in what Spen put up in the chat there, the link that he threw up in the chat. So you can access some of that there. Let's talk about the ways we make those applications, foliar versus basal versus cut stump. Foliar is where applications are taking place where the plant is actively growing during green up. And we utilize that because we can do broadcast style applications. We're not doing individual plant applications. So you can cover more acreage quicker. And if you're going to do foliar treatment, your coverage is going to be really critical. Your timing is narrower. So there's a smaller window of time that we can do that. And we'll talk about July. I talked about July being kind of the peak of that time, June and August being kind of the secondary, and then September being the third level of that. But coverage is critical. This is not something you're going to do at 10 gallon an acre. This is probably going to be a 20 to 30 gallon an acre style application. Otherwise, you're looking at basal bark treatments, or what would be called basal stump treatments, or cut stump treatments. And so basal, I really love. It's one of the most effective treatments that I can recommend for you and your producers. And you can be surgical with it. You can go through there and actually be very selective and have no impact on surrounding trees if you keep your spray onto just the desired targets here. So with basal treatments, we're going to treat roughly the bottom 18 inches of that trunk with a 1-to-3 ratio of remedy herbicide in most cases, remedy along with a basal oil or a diesel fuel. Diesel fuel we use because it's readily accessible on most farms, but you can find basal oils. JLB oil or JBL oil is probably the most common one that is seen out there. And usually this is on smaller species, 6 to 8 inches in diameter. And we're going to be essentially chemically girdling them. And so you're going to treat everything you can see in the diagram. You're going to treat the bottom 12 to 15, I would even say 18 inches. And I would even look towards that bottom right corner, and you're going to treat anything that's exposed along. So not just the stem itself, but if you have any exposed roots and the full stump that may be emerged on the ground. And the wonderful thing about this is we can do basal treatments here in these cold months. So when you have frozen soil or heavy sap conditions, you can do these treatments as long as there's not standing snow. And we see these treatments done in other industries all through the winter very consistently. And I like this treatment because it's about a 95, 99% effective treatment. You spray it, you walk away, you're done. Trade-off is that it's very intensive and it's individual plants. Same thing for cut stump treatments. People are out there cutting brush here, January, February, March. You can use the same sort of mix as basil, and people use 25% remedy and 75% diesel. But we also see people using Torlon RTU as an alternative in this sense. So you're going to treat the bark, the upper rim of the stump, any exposed roots, that conduction zone called the cambium layer on the outside edge of that. Usually the first half inch of those cut stumps in a circle is the most important to treat, as well as any exposed bark. So you don't have to go back and retreat. And you can do this in dormancy as well. But again, this is an individual plant treatment. And so it's more labor intensive. But if you're out there cutting stuff already, it's really important for many folks to go back and do this, or do this actually at the same time, so you don't have to come back and do another cut treatment 5-10 years later. So if you want to grow your pasture business overall, where can we help? And the reality is that many folks don't treat their pastures, but most producers have some pasture. Even the small landowner, or even the large farmer out there can have, let's see, we got one question. No, that's you in the chat. Most pastures go untreated, and most people are not necessarily looking towards treating their pastures, but it's a great way to enter into a conversation that doesn't start with seed corn. It doesn't start with a herbicide program on their corn or beans. It helps communicate that you're thinking about them in a more well-rounded sense. And you do have folks that, whether, if you have horse people, they're usually very interested in how to increase their production or improve their pasture or take care of their horses in a new way. And make sure that you're not dealing with poisonous plants. I get questions around poison hemlock, usually in April and May. And if you have horse people that have poison hemlock, and you help them identify that early on, you'll win a customer for a long, long time. So since most of these pastures go untreated, these are net new acres for you. It's usually a net new customer, or they're using low-end products. They're using things like a 2,4-D or a dicamba weed master sort of blend, and they're non-residual products, which, while they do have some advantage in being non-residual, they usually don't last through the season, and customers get frustrated having to treat them 2, 3, 4 times a season in some cases. What we've learned over the years is forage grasses often replace weeds pound for pound. So if we can take a pound of weeds off a pasture, we're going to put a pound of grass, if not more, on that pasture. And that generally promotes herd health. It improves their feed quality, increases their yield. It's better for animal safety. Just herd health having to do with eye injuries out here in Nebraska. Western ragweed causes a lot of eye issues, styes in eyes and things of that nature, just poking animals in the eye. And a couple vet calls that are resolved can cost customers several $100s a year. Usually a quality treatment on the front end of the season can help reduce their overall need for some of those vet calls. Currently today, our range and pasture products are part of the True Choice offer. So products like Duracore, Chaparral, Graze on Next, Remedy are all part of that program. ED3 is not at this point in time, nor is Tordon. But those programs, and you know how powerful they are if you use them, customers that can save 10-15% on some of these products might really be surprised and open up their eyes in terms of how they can utilize their True Choice account here.
Sure. Well, no, I kind of want to open it up. We're going to use the Q&A tool and see if there's any lingering questions anybody had. There is one. I know we are slightly over time, but we can touch on this very quickly. So when it comes to seeding grasses, would you rather, and Abe, I'll turn this over to you, would you rather seed grasses and then apply your herbicide to control weeds? Or would you rather get rid of the weeds and then apply your seeded grasses there? How would you best plan that?
I would encourage anyone who comes to you with a question around seeding grasses is address the weed problems as best as you can before you seed. After you seed, you have a window of time where very few herbicides make a lot of sense. So with a product like Duracor, we're roughly 30 to 40 days before you can go back and seed grasses, which is a relatively short window. Whereas if you plant your grasses first, you may be 8 to 12 weeks out before you start with a very simple 2,4-D application. So address your weed concerns first. The first year is going to be very difficult as you're getting grasses started, and we don't want to make any harsh applications of any chemistry onto those grasses until they have their secondary root system. And in good growing conditions, that could be 8 weeks, could be 12 weeks if they're in a drought sort of situation. And for many customers, the first year, it makes a lot of sense to use mowing as their weed control because we don't want to harm those young grasses. Your grass stand does not improve later on. So if you damage that grass stand in the first season, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle from there. So herbicides first, then grasses seeded later.
Great. Thank you for that. And thank you all for your questions throughout the webinar. It was good to catch those while we were on the topic, and I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So we appreciate you joining us this morning. I know it's starting to pick up early this year, but be on the lookout for a follow-up email early next week. We've made note of everybody who's on the call this morning, and we're gonna raffle off that cooler and get it over to you here soon. But like Abe had mentioned, feel free to reach out to any of us. Our contacts are down below, so feel free to snap a picture and use those links in the chat that we shared. Those are yours to download and use with your customers. So thank you for your time again, and good luck this spring and coming into growing season, and look forward to hearing from y'all soon.
You bet. Thank you so much for being here. And again, can't underline enough. If you have need a specific prescription, or you have some questions about pastures, how to approach them, we're more than happy to help you, whether it's Sven or Tanner or myself. We can help you get set up for success this season.